Chapter 3. The Transcendental Movement. As another straw showing which way the philosophical wind is blowing, in these days of intellectual unrest, and as a corroboration of the statements made in the preceding chapters of this book, I ask that you consider the following quotations from the latest work of Professor William James of Harvard University, which work is based upon a series of lectures upon the philosophical situation of the present day. It should be stated, however, that these quotations do not necessarily represent Professor James's own personal beliefs or opinions, but are merely expressions of his observations regarding the prevailing spirit of modern philosophical thought in the universities and among men of advanced education. Professor James says, "Those of us who are sexagenarians have witnessed in one's own persons one of those gradual mutations of intellectual climate done to innumerable influences that make the thought of a past generation seem as foreign to its successor as if it were the oppression of a different race of men. The theological machinery that spoke so livingly to our ancestors with its finite age of the world, its creation out of nothing, its judicial morality and eschatology, its relish for rewards and punishments, its treatment of God as an external contriver, an intelligent and moral governor, sound as odd to most of us as if it were some outlandish savage religion." Professor James then goes on to speak of the spirit of modern philosophical thought in the universities as follows. "Dualistic theism is professed at all Catholic seats or learning, whereas it has of late years tended to disappear at our British and American universities, and to be replaced by a monistic pantheism more or less disguised. I have an impression that ever since Th. Green's time absolute idealism has been decidedly in the ascendant at Oxford. It is in the ascendant at my own University of Harvard. Also, our contemporary mind having once F6 are all grasped the possibility of a mote intimate Weltanschauung. The only opinion quite worthy of arresting our attention will fall within the general scope of what may roughly be called the pantheistic field of vision, the vision of God as the indwelling divine rather than the external creator, and of human life a part and parcel of that deep reality. In the present chapter, it is my purpose to consider one of the most direct and immediate of the innumerable influences to which is due the present gradual mutation of intellectual climate that makes the thought of a past generation seem as foreign to its successor as if it were the expression of a different race of men, as Professor James has so well stated. This direct and immediate influence of which I speak, which has had so much to do with the bubbling of the Crucible of Modern Thought, is the influence of the Transcendental Movement of New England of 1830 to 1850, and the influence of Emerson in particular. I feel justified in asserting that the present condition of spiritual unrest and the prevalence of monistic idealism, while having its original source far back in the past history of though nevertheless reached us through the direct channel of the great Transcendental Movement in New England in the first half of the last century, and largely through the individual channel of expression of Ralph Waldo Emerson. The lovers and admirers of Emerson have long claimed this, and the opponents of the movement are now beginning to recognize it, as one disgusted Orthodox speaker recently said. Emerson is the fellow who is at the bottom of all this trouble. His pantheistic teachings are now bearing fruit. The beginnings of the Transcendental Movement in New England may be seen in the remarkable interest manifested by educated New Englanders during the first 25 years of the 19th century toward the classical literature of England and Germany. Previous to that time, the influence of Locke and Bentham had been dominant in philosophical thought in this country. The theory of innate ideas was denied, and there was a decided tendency in favor of the utilitarian basis of ethics and morals. Protesting against this view, some of the American Unitarians advanced ideas which, even in that early day, were denominated the New Thought, and declared their preference for the conception that man possessed innate ideas and also higher faculties transcending the senses and the ordinary understanding. These advocates of the earlier New Thought felt that religion and morality had a higher source than ordinary reason, and must be placed in the category of revelations of the intuition of man, arising from the presence of the indwelling spirit. The influence of Coleridge, Wordsworth, Herder, Goethe, and others began to displace that of the old literary idols, and exerted a decided direction in the formation of the New Thought, which was supplanting the older philosophical conceptions. Coleridge taught the doctrine of a higher reason, or transcendental intuition, by which he held the advanced soul might exercise an immediate perception of things supersensible, and which was not a faculty or property of the mind, but rather the manifestation of the indwelling spirit, which latter was a spark from the universal spirit. He held that there was but one spirit, which was shared in by all human beings, the many being, in a sense, identical with the one. Wordsworth taught a poetical pantheism, with its conception of a nature animated by the universal spirit, and as universal mind manifested as law and order. The influence of Goethe and other German writers were in the same general trend. All pointed in the direction of a new pantheistic philosophy. A new interest was awakened in Plato, in the Neoplatonists, and a demand was shown for the writing of the mystics and idealists of the past. In this fruitful soil, the roots of the New England Transcendental Movement found that nourishment which led to its rapid growth. Transcendentalism has been defined, briefly, as the philosophical conception that there can be knowledge of transcendental elements, or matters wholly beyond the ordinary experience of the human mind. The term was used by Kant. As Wallace says, Kant's philosophy describes itself as transcendentalism. The word causes a shudder and suggests things unutterable. Transcendentalism is diametrically opposed to the philosophical views which hold that all knowledge arises from sensation or experience, and is also opposed to the agnostic view that reality is unknowable. But the term itself has taken on a wider and more general signification by reason of its popular use by the New England Transcendentalists and its identification with the philosophy of Emerson in the popular mind. In fact, the English-speaking peoples now use the word generally in the sense of designating the ideas and principles of the New England school, rather than those of the Kantian philosophy. Margaret Fuller, one of the prominent New England Transcendentalists, in her Memoirs, says, "Transcendentalism was an assertion of the inalienable integrity of man, of the immanence of divinity in instinct. On the somewhat stunted stock of Unitarianism, whose characteristic dogma was trust in human reason, as correlative to supreme wisdom, had been grafted German idealism, as taught by masters of most various schools, by Kant and Jacobi, Fichte and Novella, Schelling and Hegel, Schleiermacher and De Wet, by Madame de Staël, Cousin, Coleridge, and Carlyle. And the result was a vague, yet exalting, conception of the godlike nature of the human spirit. Transcendentalism, as viewed by its disciples, was a pilgrimage from the idolatrous world of creeds and rituals to the temple of the living God in the soul." Herzog gives us the orthodox view of the philosophy in his Religious Encyclopedia as follows. In religion, the typical transcendentalist might be a sublimated theist. He was not, in any accepted sense, a Christian. He believed in no devil, in no hell, in no evil, in no dualism of any kind, in no spiritual authority, in no savior, in no church. He was humanitarian and an optimist. His faith had no backward look. Its essence was aspiration, not contrition. This last quotation is particularly interesting, inasmuch as it proves the contention of the influence of transcendentalism upon the modern philosophical and religious thought. Compare Herzog's statements of what the transcendentalist did not believe, and what he did believe, with the prevailing spirit of religio-philosophical thought, and see how the criticism of transcendentalism becomes the prophecy of the popular thought of the early 20th century. Surely this is a clear case of cause and effect. About 1830, and the years immediately following, the various elements from which the Transcendental Movement was afterward composed began to approach each other, drawn together by the attraction of common interest. Emerson's Nature, written in 1836, was an active element in the crystallization, although the writings of others had much to do with the amalgamation. These several books were so closely identified in their general philosophies and tendencies that their readers began to form a loosely connected cult. Channing and Ripley, both prominent in Unitarianism and the New Thought of the day, finally got together and formed a society for mutual endeavor and philosophical inquiry. Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Channing, Ripley, Brownson, and Hedge, all prominent in the general movement, met and discussed the formation of a society. The term transcendentalism was then first applied to the movement. Emerson says of this, "Nobody knows who first applied the name. The society was first called the Symposium and afterward the Transcendental Club." Among the general subjects forming part of the earlier discussions were those of pantheism and mysticism, respectively. The interest in the movement grew rapidly, and many of the brightest minds in New England were attracted to it. While the subjects discussed, taught, and considered were various, it is safe to say that as a whole they were most unorthodox and contrary to the general public belief and opinion. Many of the ideas and opinions so advanced are quite familiar to the people of the present day and are taught in many pulpits, but at the time of the Transcendental Movement they were regarded as heretical and atheistic, and aroused the fiercest denunciation and antagonism from the orthodox pulpit and press. The formation of the Brook Farm community at West Roxbury, Massachusetts, by George Ripley in 1841, is a part of the history of Transcendentalism, for the reason that some of the leading lights in the latter movement became members of the new community. Men like Ripley, Hawthorne, Alcott, Curtis, Channing, and Dana, and women like Margaret Fuller, added a brilliancy to the Brook Farm community, which has given it a prominent place in the history of the general movement. The aim of the community, as stated by one of their number, was more effectually to promote the great purposes of human culture, to establish the external relations of life on the basis of wisdom and purity. The community flourished for a number of years, but like all such attempts, finally failed, the members dispersing, but carrying the spirit of the community with them in many directions. In 1840, the publication of the Dial began. This was the organ of New England Transcendentalism, and naturally served to brio the movement into still more general notice and popularity. Margaret Fuller was the first editor, and Emerson, Channing, Alcott, Theodore Parker, Ripley, and Thoreau were among the contributors to the first number. Emerson wrote the opening article entitled, "The Editors to the Reader." During the first 2 years of the existence of The Dial, Margaret Fuller was assisted in her editorial work by Ripley and Emerson. After that time, Emerson became the sole editor. Much that was crude and fanciful appeared in the pages of this publication, but also much that will hold a permanent place in the history of American literature. It marked an era in the history of American magazines and gave an impetus, the effects of which are still noticeable. After 4 years of struggle, it was finally discontinued. The life of the Transcendental Movement may be said to be embraced by the years 1830 and 1850, though the beginnings were still further back in the century, and the influence of the movement still lives as the heart and spirit of many modern schools of thought and activity which are slow to acknowledge their indebtedness to it. Its real source was the Great Awakening of nearly a century before its time, in which the hold of Calvinism was rudely shaken and weakened, and which brought to the New England mind a new interest in Arminianism and Arianism, and which served to prepare the cradle for Unitarianism, which was afterward born. Transcendentalism was the natural spiritual child of the great spiritual unrest which had preceded it by about a century, and which wrought a great change in religious and philosophical thought and ideals in New England, which section at that time undoubtedly was the intellectual center of this country. It was the offspring of liberal Christian thought, combined with Neoplatonism, Oriental religions, and occult philosophy. It was perhaps nearer akin to what philosophy calls mysticism than to any other one form of thought. The spirit of transcendentalism was most elusive, as all writers have remarked. The current impression at the present time may be stated in a quotation from Professors McGilvary and Trent in their article on the subject in the New International E3 Encyclopedia as follows. It is difficult to disengage the elements, to delimit it in point of time, to say what it really accomplished, to determine what it became. The era of the Transcendentalists was in many respects an American Renaissance, the effects of which were not confined to the country, but were spread chiefly through the writings of Emerson, Thoreau, and Channing, to England, and to some extent to the continent of Europe. That their ideas were tag ani often transcended reason, not to say common sense, that their literary work was largely amateurish, that their extravagances gave much occasion to legitimate ridicule, that their so-called movement was the forerunner of religious and social mania of all sorts, can scarcely be gainsaid. But it is equally idle to deny the loftiness of their aims and the importance of their work. Be one's opinion of transcendentalism what it may, no careful student of the Transcendental Movement can doubt the fact that in it may be found the underlying and immediate causes of the modern effects, manifested as the New Thought movement, on the one hand, and the tendency toward monistic idealism or pantheism, evidenced in the philosophical thought of today, on the other hand. While it is true that the real causes of these later movements must be sought for still further back in the history of human thought, It cannot be doubted that the older impulses reached the present movements through the direct channel of the Transcendentalism of New England. An examination of the teachings and writings of that school, when compared with those of the later schools, shows a direct chain or sequence and of cause and effect. Those who are looking for the causes of the modern schools of thought will fail to find them unless they take into active consideration the Transcendental Movement of New England of 1830 to 1850. And not only is this true, but it will be found that many other and apparently unrelated schools of thought arose about the same time, not entirely in sympathy with the general movement, but apparently arising from the influence thereof. Some of these side schools have their modern successors, tracing descent in a direct line, so that the influence of Transcendentalism in New England may be considered the one vital factor which has brought about that state of affairs which has resulted in the old conception sounding as odd to most of us as if it were some outlandish savage religion, as Professor James has said, and in making possible the statement of the same careful authority that the only opinion quite worthy of arresting our attention will fall within the general scope of what may roughly be called the pantheistic field of vision, the vision of God as the indwelling divine, rather than the external creator, and of human life as part and parcel of that great reality. Transcendentalism is the direct and immediate cause of this state of affairs, and Ralph Waldo Emerson is recognized as the fullest and clearest expression of Transcendentalism. As the Orthodox speaker previously quoted said, Emerson is the fellow who is at the bottom of all this trouble. Then let us see what Emerson really taught and what he stood for. This will help to show us the connection between 1830 to 1850 and 1909.